Good evening, everyone. My name is Martin Gettings. I'm a member of both the Worshipful Company of Constructors and their Scholarships Committee. I'm going to be your host and compere for this evening. It's something I've always wanted to do, so I'm absolutely delighted about that. But before I do anything, I must notify you that this event is being recorded. And if you want to remain anonymous, please switch off your camera and amend your name tag. Now, in a moment, I'm going to explain the running order, the timings, and some basic housekeeping. But first, a warm welcome to you all to this, the dissemination event for the Sir Ian Dixon Scholars of 2020. And we're absolutely delighted to welcome Lady Valerie Dixon here tonight. And we've been entertained for the last 5 or 10 minutes, Lady Dixon, with your getting to grips with the technology. And of course, it's something that we've all had to do. We've all had to do in this tremendously unusual year. Now, as many of you know, as head of his business and also as president of the CIOB, the late Sir Ian was a very active promoter of innovation and learning throughout his career. And it was this passion for innovation and technology that led Sir Ian to the launch of this scholarships program back in 1997. Its purpose being to support young professionals to complete short but very topical research projects, to both develop them and also share their findings to contribute wider value to the construction community. So I'm sure Sir Ian would very much approve of our use of technology here tonight, this being our first virtual scholarship dissemination event, and I'm sure it's going to be a success, but let's hope that the technology holds out. So, to the order of business. Our 2020 scholars, Mackenzie Thompson and Eugene Healy, and I know they're here because I've seen them, are the stars of tonight's show. And we have a presentation coming up each from Mackenzie and from Eugene. At the end of each of their presentations, there's a short time for some Q&A. So we'll be watching the chat box for questions to come in, or if you've got anything pressing, you can raise your hand either virtually or physically and ask a question at that point. Following the presentations, round about 5 to 7, we will have a short break, and then but we'll check in on the timings. Then, you know, these things have a habit of moving around a little bit. And then round about 7 o'clock, back at 7, my brilliant colleague, Anna Koukoulis, will welcome you back for a panel discussion with all the scholars and all of the mentors. I'm not going to go through the introductions right now. The mentors and the scholars will introduce themselves as they go through. Following the panel discussion, we will then hear some closing remarks from our master, Arthur Seymour. And I've also seen that Arthur's here. He's waving his hand there. Nice to see you, Arthur. Finally, Anna and Craig will close proceedings off. Now, a note on housekeeping. What we don't want is a repeat of the Hanforth Village Parish event. So what we'd like to do, if you're not speaking, we would like you to remain on mute. Except you, Lady Valerie, you don't need to touch anything. You don't press the wrong button. But anybody who is familiar with the technology, please remain on silent so that to give the speakers a chance to speak. If you want to raise a question, stick your hand up or press the question button, and we'll do our best to hear your question. And that's it, really. We're going to try and do something different. This is the first time we've done the Scholars event virtually, so we're fingers crossed it's going to work. Now, for over 20 years, a diverse range of topics have been covered by the Constructors Scholarships. They have initiated further activities for the scholars and their employers, and they've also stimulated debate and wider action within the industry. So no pressure, guys. We're looking for a high level of presentation tonight. But the topics for tonight's talk, I'm sure, will be no different. So without further ado, I'm going to be coming over to Ben de Sanchez now to introduce himself and our first speaker. So over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Martin. Evening all. So I'm Ben Desange, a liveryman and the Worshipful Company's mentor of Mackenzie Thompson. This is the first time I've actually introduced someone that I haven't physically met, but we've had a good year together. I'm going to start with a few words from myself and my experience working with Mackenzie over the last 12 months, and a few words from Jeff Tidmarsh, who's the Senior Design Manager at Sir Robert McAlpine, Sir Robert have sponsored and supported Mackenzie over the same 12-month period. So here goes. From our first virtual meeting, Mackenzie has impressed me throughout the last 12 months. The combination of her passion for the topic, particularly her focus on improving the working conditions of the builders, which the topic is upon, and her professionalism have been inspiring and have made our year together a complete pleasure. I commend Mackenzie on her non-conformity, publishing her work in pushing the boundaries and choosing a graphical playbook as a way of publishing her work, as opposed to a more traditional dissertation format. I think credit here also goes to Deborah Poulin for supporting all of the mentees on this basis, scholars, and allowing them to present their works in more modern fashion. So a few words on Mackenzie, a few facts. Her chosen career is architecture and urban planning, and she chose this career following a visit to Berlin and witnessing the stark difference between East and West, rich and poor. She read her undergrad architecture degree at Liverpool University, where she worked with a small architectural practice, Craig Foster. And Mackenzie has been a winner throughout her short career to date. Ours is a third scholarship that Mackenzie has won, our SIDS scholarship. Prior to that, she won a scholarship with the Arkwright Engineering, which supported herself through A-levels, really impressive. And to get to Sir Robert McAlpine, she won a student competition as a young architect, organised by the London Festival of Architecture, which probably swiftly segues into SRM. Some words from Jeff. So SRM, like many of the major contractors, had been on a CSR drive around junior schools and secondary schools. About 10 years ago, Sir Robert's changed that focus and started looking to work with older students. This quickly settled into an annual project working with architects, and almost as quickly focused on designing welfare, which Sir Robert's found was a sort of a novel area, something a bit different and unique, but the benefits they found were really startling. Enter Mackenzie, following her winning of the London Festival of Architecture Award, and she worked with Jeff and also Alex Scott Whitby, a consulting engineer to Sir Robert, providing designed welfare provision for 1,000 operatives in Battersea. This segues quite nicely and pushes, our SIDS scholarship works quite nicely with McAlpine and where the industry is going, really trying to invest more in the people who build our buildings. Jeff recognises Mackenzie's work as a first organised modern research into workers and welfare, and he thinks Mackenzie's record is a really important step for Sir Robert McAlpine. Jeff wanted me to thank Mackenzie, wish her well for the future, and just confirm without any doubt that she's very welcome back to Sir Robert's at any time in the future. So in summary, and immediately before I hand over to Mackenzie, my computer's playing up, which is worrying, Mackenzie's got a real social conscience, and I've seen that throughout the last year. She's extremely focused and professional. She is cutting edge, and she really wants to make a positive influence on people and communities through her architecture and urban planning. So over to Mackenzie. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ben. So let me share the screen. Great, so hopefully you can all see this now. So good evening. For most of us, I think the construction site is a really exciting place, a space where new buildings are being created for everyone to enjoy. But what my research is looking at is actually what space is there for the builders to enjoy. So this research is titled "A Building for the Builders, What is the Value of the Welfare Facility?" So before we begin, what is the welfare facility? Well, welfare facilities are those necessary for the well-being of your employees, such as washing, toilet, rest and changing facilities, and somewhere clean to eat and drink during breaks. And well-being is the state of feeling healthy and happy. So essentially, welfare facilities are those necessary for the health and happiness of your employees. So to follow on from Ben, a little bit about me. For those of you I haven't met yet, my name is Mackenzie Thompson. I graduated from the University of Liverpool in 2019 with a degree in architecture. I then worked as a Part 1 architectural assistant for a small architecture practice based in Liverpool, where I got a wide range of experience on both really small projects, sort of your extensions on houses, but also on big master planning projects too. In September, I'll be doing a master's in architecture with urban planning. But yes, most importantly, with regards to this research, was my experience with Sir Robert McAlpine on the welfare facilities at Battersea Power Station. So, what were the aims of my study? My primary aim was to increase awareness of the welfare facility as an architectural typology. And to put that simply, it means just understanding that the welfare facility is a building in its own right. I also wanted to assess the value of the welfare facility, how important it is, and how much money we should be spending on it. I wanted to understand the current attitude surrounding welfare facilities in the construction industry, from both blue and white-collared workers. And finally, I was taking this evidence and making some recommendations so we can continue to improve welfare in the future. So today we only have 15 minutes, so this will be a really speedy run through. We'll start by looking at existing information, like a background research, the topic. We'll then move on to the primary research, interviews, questionnaires, and case studies I've undertaken as a part of the Sir Ian Dixon Scholarship. And then finally, we'll go on to those recommendations. So why this study? Well, 1 in 4 people experience mental health issues each year, and in 2017, mental health issues cost employers £35 billion. So we know there's this prevailing issues with mental health and well-being in society, and actually the construction industry is affected by this even more than some other industries. We've also got some evidence to show that to improve the well-being of employees, we should provide welfare facilities with high standards of safety, hygiene, accessibility, natural light, ventilation, temperature control, workspace and seating. And for those of us that have been in welfare facilities, we can see that actually this isn't often provided. So what my research is looking at is how can we build on this? What else can the welfare facility achieve? And is it important in tackling other issues that the industry is facing? So historically, we know that welfare wasn't valued. It doesn't take very much to think of an industrial sort of working environment during Victorian society where actually productivity was prioritised over health and safety, let alone happiness. And a key example of this was the Woodhead Tunnel project of 1845. Now, this project was built by the navvies, who were Britain's railway builders. And on this project, 32 workers died, 250 were seriously injured. But what shocked me most was the 28 people that died due to cholera, due to the poor living and working conditions. So actually we see that even though the industry didn't value welfare at this point in time, welfare is vital because it prevents issues like this occurring. And thankfully we've made huge strides since then. At the time, we do see attempts to improve working conditions. Edwin Chadwick, a social reformer, attempted to highlight these issues, as did the builders themselves in the London Builders' Strike of 1859, but it amounted to very little. They were fighting against an industry which had so much more power than them, they couldn't make any substantial changes. Where we do see changes, however, is through legislation. Legislation such as the 1974 Health and Safety at Work Act and the CDM regulations. And legislation is vital because no longer are individuals fighting against this big industry with lots of power, but actually the industry is looking holistically at its issues and saying, we want to make improvements to benefit everyone, how are we going to enforce this? And I think that's important when looking at mental health and well-being. So today we are conscious of this issue of mental health and well-being in the industry. I think we've even had some previous Sir Ian Dixon scholars look at it, but I think it's important to recognise that these issues haven't just come to the surface. They've been bubbling underneath the surface for a long time. In the 1960s, Dominic Behan wrote the song Building Up and Tearing England Down. And if you read the lyrics and listen to the song, you'll hear all about workers feeling undervalued and the dire working conditions that they had to experience. Likewise, the navvies, who were subject to the awful conditions at the Woodhead Tunnel, they were known as being violent and having drunken tendencies, again issues relating to health and well-being and mental health. So we see that actually, yes, now the industry is aware of these issues and wanting to tackle them, but they've been below the surface for much longer. So we need to listen to those that are on the site to actually see how we can make these changes. So we'll now move on to the primary research that I undertook. So the first step was interviewing 14 professionals in the industry to gather what they believed about the welfare facility, how important it was to them. They had a wide range of experience, some with up to 35 years in the industry, and they had a variety of job roles. I also issued a questionnaire to 6 London construction sites where I received over 353 responses, and that enabled me to understand how site workers predominantly viewed the welfare facility. Finally, I looked at what happened to the accident frequency rating on sites that used architecture students to design their welfare, and whether this can actually provide us with some interesting ideas about how we progress with welfare in the future. So, the first quote from one of the interviews was, "It should be a question we ask, how are you going to look after your guys?" And I think if we take anything from this talk, this is something we should be considering. How are we going to look after the guys on site? And what the interviewees revealed was that actually clients are often ill-informed of their role and responsibility, and there's a huge disparity in the industry. On large sites with big clients, lots of money, your major contractors, actually welfare is pretty good, but it's the smaller sites that we need to look out for. And how are we going to ensure that workers on a variety of sites are receiving sufficient welfare? The second quote, "Younger generations now are a lot more clean inspired, and now with the COVID, everyone is going to have to become super clean." So actually this quote really stood out to me for multiple reasons. The interviewees revealed that actually welfare is vital. So professionals in the industry said, yes, it's vital, it's essential, workers deserve it, and that was it really. And actually there's been massive improvements as well in the industry. A lot of the people I interviewed gave me anecdotes about times on site 30 years ago where the welfare consisted of a timber hut with a bucket in the corner. So thankfully we have made huge strides, but actually there is a prevailing attitude of doing the bare minimum. And this links in with this quote. If we think about this quote and the focus on younger generations, I think we can see that welfare actually serves us as so much more than just a place that provides health and happiness to the people that use it. Actually, welfare could be used to bring more people into the industry. I think welfare has long been looked at as the place where you get a bacon sandwich or a cup of tea, but actually I think welfare is so much more encompassing than that, because it includes the prayer rooms that make Muslims feel welcome on site, or the female WCs that make women feel more welcomed in the construction industry. So actually, if we think about welfare more holistically, we see just how important it is. And the final quote, "When you have clean facilities, clean sites, and everything is kept spick and span and rubbish away, then the quality goes up." So far, I think I've spoken a lot about how actually the welfare facility benefits the site worker, but I don't think this is as far as welfare goes. The interviewees revealed that actually better welfare facilities usually lead to better quality on site and better productivity. So we can show clients that actually, if you invest a bit more into the welfare, you're going to get better work out of the guys on site. Perhaps we'll see just how valuable the welfare facility is. And in that case, not only is the welfare facility benefiting the site worker, but it can benefit the contractor and the client too. So now we move on to the questionnaires. So as I said, I received 353 responses from 6 London construction sites. 80.7% of those that answered the questionnaire worked predominantly on site, and 43% were over the age of 40. Again, when we come back to that overarching question of what is the value of the welfare facility, 66% of those questioned stated that the welfare facility was very important / essential. And that was when they were given a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being very important / essential, and 1 being not important, not required. 66% gave us that 5 out of 5. The questionnaire also showed that 48% of workers used the welfare facility 2 to 3 times a day, with a further 18% using it more than 3 times a day. So actually, if we've got an issue with our workers on site and we want to interact with them in some way, perhaps the welfare facility is the tool to achieve this. It seems to be the hub which workers continuously come back and forth between. Now, regrettably, 35% of workers had worked on a site which they perceived to have inadequate facilities in the past 36 months. And I think this is a really important statistic for the industry to question, because I think there are potentially 2 things that could be occurring here. Now, either A, sites aren't meeting their legislative requirements, in which case we need greater enforcement. But also, I think another option is perhaps they are meeting what the requirements state, but these are still being perceived as inadequate by the workers. In which case, perhaps the expectations of people on site and what they think provides a healthy and happy environment, and the industry at large and what they think provides a healthy and happy environment, needs greater dialogue so that we can ensure that actually we're working to the same sort of goal. Style, however, doesn't seem to have a massive impact. On the next slide, I'll show you 2 very different types of welfare facilities, and there was less than 5% difference between the vote when asked to pick which one was their favourite. So here are the 2 welfare facilities. One that I think is what most people would think of as a welfare facility, and the other, a really innovative design. What did seem important to those that answered the questionnaire, however, was that we did have enough of all the provisions that are required. What was important, there was enough WCs, enough hot taps, enough seats, rather than the style of the space itself. And to two statistics which I think really sell this idea that welfare is of value. 61% of workers stated that having a good welfare facility motivated them to work harder. So again, this links back to that quotes we had from the interviewees about welfare. The interviewees, or professionals in the industry, believe they get better productivity and quality when the welfare is improved, and the site workers agree with this. So we're seeing there is this attitude in the industry. And further on from that, 83% of workers believe that having a good welfare facility improved their well-being. And when we think of these issues in the industry of mental health, well-being, and the 1 in 4 people that will experience mental health issues each year, I think we can see that actually the welfare facility is a tool that we should be using to prevent some of these issues from occurring. So now onto the case studies. So I'm aware this slide may look a little bit dry, but I think it is showing us something really interesting. So as we've said, one major UK contractor has been using architecture students to design their welfare facilities. And on 4 out of 5 of their sites, we see that the accident frequency ratings for the project lifetime is lower than that of a comparable regional project. And I think this is really interesting because we're starting to see that not only are people perceiving welfare to affect life on site, but we're getting some numbers to support this. And actually in my report, that's what I say we need more of. We need more research looking at what is the effect on absenteeism, vandalism on site, waste materials when we invest in welfare. So then we can actually say to a client, if you invest X amount, you will be getting this back in some other form. So that's what we see from these. And then back to my original aim too, of understanding that the welfare facility is a building in its own right. Welfare facilities can be the porter cabins that we've seen, and actually style doesn't seem to have a massive difference. But we can see that welfare doesn't have to be that. It can be more innovative, we can think more outside of the box, we can use materials already available on site. Here, for instance, the table wraps around the space, so it feels more like a restaurant than your welfare facility. Again, when thinking about what younger people want and the different requirements that different generations have, we can see that welfare doesn't necessarily have to always look the same. This one as well, we see reused materials, the walls in the back. I think you can see that they're made up of lots of different panels, and that's because they were actually old doors that were found on site. The light fitting as well was reused. So good welfare doesn't always have to cost more, it's just thinking innovatively with the materials we've already got. So hopefully you've seen that welfare is of value, it is important, and actually we need to invest more into it, whether that's time, money, research. I'll now give you some recommendations so that we can continue to make improvements with regards to welfare. So the first thing we need to do is tackle this attitude of doing the bare minimum. We've seen that actually what the welfare facility has potential, so let's tap into that. And I think we can do that by conducting further research, as I said, on aspects such as absenteeism and vandalism and waste materials. Let's see how welfare does impact this. And I think this data should be published as a relevant good practice metric. I think when clients visit construction sites, they should visit the welfare facilities and question whether the facilities are adequate for the staff. Let's think when we go to welfare facilities, not only is this a space where health is fostered, but is happiness fostered here when we think of well-being. We need more inspections on smaller construction sites to reduce the disparity mentioned in the interviews, and policy, legislation, or both are needed to support industry-wide improvements. I think the construction industry should view the welfare facility as a tool to improve morale, productivity, and well-being. And when a company is looking at best practice, the welfare facility should be considered an investment area. We need effective time management for comfortable use so that welfare facilities can function best at their busiest rather than at average capacity. What I actually saw in the responses from my questionnaires was that actually a lot of the guys on site felt that there weren't enough WCs, there weren't enough hot taps and facilities like this. And perhaps that is the case, in which case we need to increase these numbers. But perhaps they're just all being used at the same time. So if we can stagger them and stagger the usage, like we've been doing with COVID-19, perhaps we'll have a less stressful environment for everyone. And finally, I think we need to be innovative. I think the construction industry should tap into architecture students' potential more widely as a form of community engagement. Not only will this benefit the contractor in community engagement requirements, but it will benefit architecture students exposing them to life on the construction site. And hopefully we've seen that it will benefit the site workers too. And I think whenever we do this, we need to consider maintenance to ensure that working conditions are sustainable. There's no point having an innovative idea that lasts for 2 weeks and for the rest of the time it's awful to work in. So thank you for listening to this talk. Hopefully you've seen that actually welfare facilities are far more interesting than just having a little porta cabin on the edge of a site. It's not the necessary evil that we have to provide, but actually it can benefit us in a lot of ways. And that's not only the site worker, but the contractor and the client too. So thank you for listening.
That was excellent, Mackenzie. And at this moment, we are going to have a virtual round of applause. And I didn't need to prompt anybody to do that. I can see everybody clapping away there. Well done. Well done. Now, we have a few moments for questions. Does anybody want to be bold and put their hand up and ask a question of Mackenzie on that brilliant presentation? I can see Bob Heathfield has his hand straight in the air there. So, Bob, if you'd like to unmute yourself and fire away. You're on mute, Bob.
Right, great, thank you. Mackenzie, a brilliant presentation, and I do congratulate you. Well researched, and I'm sure you've learned an awful lot out of it. I can imagine that most of us watching will have learned things as well. One thing, a couple of comments. I thought the feedback that you got in terms from your questionnaires, from my past experience, I think you did exceedingly well to get that many responses back. In the past, I know past scholars have found it extraordinarily difficult to get a good number of responses from which they could then deduce their findings. I think you did extraordinarily well there. Just one question though, in terms of the sites that you picked, clearly they are what one would only deem much larger construction sites. Larger construction sites and larger contractors, generally speaking, I say generally speaking, will attend to and have the facilities to provide the facilities an awful lot better than many of the smaller contractors. And the vast majority of contracting projects around the UK will be small to medium-sized enterprises with much smaller sites. Did you get any views or any recommendations for the smaller construction sites? Because the smaller construction sites would find it extraordinarily difficult to have such a wide range of welfare facilities. Granted, they should be a good deal better than what they have at the moment, but to use the phrase, size does matter. And on construction sites, if you haven't got a lot of space, that would impinge on the facilities to be provided. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yes, so that was one of my main limitations actually from the research. All of my questionnaires came from larger contractors, and I'm aware that obviously that is a limitation. And I think that's even more shocking when we think of that statistic where 35% perceive that they had inadequate facilities. So actually, is that number higher? That's something that we need to consider as an industry. So no, I haven't actually heard from smaller sites, but I think that actually the principles taken, this attitude of not doing the bare minimum, being innovative with the space and the materials we've got, I think that can actually stretch through a variety of sites. I don't think it necessarily needs to cost more or take up a lot of space. I think when you use architectural design processes or students or something along that lines, you can actually create really interesting spaces with a very limited site available.
Thank you, Mackenzie. In the interests of time, I think we're going to move on now to our next presentation. There will be a chance to ask more questions of Mackenzie in the panel session. So thank you very much for that question, Bob. Okay, so moving right along. I'm not going to do introductions, as I said earlier, only introduce the mentor and let the mentor introduce the speaker. So next up, it's Jason Farnell, and Jason is going to introduce Eugene. So over to you, Jason. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. My name is Jason Farnell. I'm a liveryman of the Worshipful Company. My scholar, Eugene Healy, is also an architect. Eugene studied in Dublin, where he graduated in architecture, and he worked on housing and mixed developments in Ireland before relocating to London in 2006. And since 2009, Eugene's been working almost exclusively on major infrastructure projects. He's worked on Crossrail, he's worked on aviation, road schemes, and he's got a real passion for his subject. Some of his major achievements have been significant delivery on Crossrail. He's also the lead architect on the refurbishment of Waterloo International Station. And currently his job is now client side rather than consultancy side on the largest rail infrastructure project since the Victorians. The piece of research that Eugene is going to present shortly is all about adding value to these major infrastructure projects through good design and interaction between all the stakeholders. It's a real call to action for the industry, and it's been a real pleasure working with Eugene through this last year, although my part has been very small. Just as an aside, besides having the lockdown, Eugene and his wife have also delivered a new baby, and he's changed jobs, and he's produced a tremendous piece of research. And not only is it an academic, it is something that Eugene feels really strongly about, and he's on a personal front, he really wants to see that he could deliver something into infrastructure to change the way things are done currently. Anyway, that's enough from me. I look forward to hearing your reaction on Eugene's presentation, and I'm certainly looking forward to reading his full report when it's published shortly. Anyway, over to you, Eugene.
Thank you, Jason, for that very kind introduction. I'm just going to share my screen, so if you can just let me know when you can see it, I'd be very grateful.
All good, Eugene, we can see that.
Fantastic. Okay, so thank you everyone very much for joining me for this. This is a very brief overview of the research I've been undertaking for the last year. It looks at the role of designer and contractor collaboration in delivering infrastructure value. And before I talk about that in more detail, I would just, let me just move this slide. Sorry, I'm just trying to move the slide on. Here we go, thank you. Before I talk about that in more detail, I'd just like to introduce myself. As Jason mentioned, I am an architect by profession with 10 years in UK infrastructure, but really my passion is infrastructure rather than buildings, and that's because I think it has a role to play in delivering a kind of a civic value that we should all be proud of, and not just solving everyday problems, but offering wider value. And to illustrate that, I'd just like to talk about the two images on the screen here. On the left-hand side is Bazalgette's interceptor sewers from 1867. And this was a really transformative project for London. It solved the big issue of the day, which was the big stink, which was sewage flowing straight into the Thames, but it also offered much more wider value than that. It reclaimed 37 acres from the river, and it used that land to develop new placemaking, a new urban realm all along the front of the river from Westminster to Blackfriars Bridge. It also went even further and introduced the cut and cover tunnel for one of the first underground railways in the world, which we now know as the District and Circle line as part of the London Underground network. And on the right-hand side of the screen is a project that we're delivering today, which is 150 years later, but still demonstrates some of the same thinking. And that is, it's got the functional aspects in terms of providing access down to the drains below, but it's also doing more than that. It's creating a new urban realm on the river. It's giving London a new public space for events, and ultimately creating a new legacy for the built environment in the city. And I think the lessons from these two projects is that infrastructure, because it's so transformative, it can offer more beyond its core function. It can deliver benefits which have lasting consequences beyond its core uses. And the key to achieving that is a holistic design approach, an approach which very early in the project recognizes that extra value and then works with a broad range of stakeholders to deliver that value. And that brings me to the research. It starts with a question. If good design is the key to unlocking value in infrastructure design, then how can designers and contractors collaborate with clients to deliver it? So the aims of this research are firstly to validate that statement, to, through literature review, really examine the role of design on value creation in infrastructure. Secondly, I wanted to analyze, to identify current industry blockers that potentially stop that value being delivered. And lastly, I wanted to finish with a series of recommendations that could be adopted in industry. So starting with the literature review, I carried out a review of a broad range of materials ranging from government policy and government papers through to independent advisory such as the National Infrastructure Commission. And that research demonstrated that there's 6 key ways that good design can deliver value in infrastructure. And the first one is obvious, it's capital. So good design can deliver requirements at the lowest cost by designing for scale or designing for manufacture and assembly, etc. But it can also design for life cycle value by minimizing operational expenditure, specifying long life durable materials, designing layouts which are fundamentally flexible over the lifetime of the asset. But going beyond the core function, good design can also create wider economic value by unlocking adjoining development sites, encouraging inward investment, and environmental value by reducing carbon in delivery and use. It can also offer social value by identifying opportunities for local supply chains, training opportunities, and creating community benefits. And ultimately, it can create user value. And that user value isn't just about creating more efficient, more reliable pieces of infrastructure for the people that use them. It's also about leaving a lasting legacy for the built environment. And if we think about, for example, to illustrate that point, the way we view Victorian viaducts today, they're still functional parts of our infrastructure, but they're also more than that. They're part of the landscape, they're part of our industrial heritage, and part of the national identity. And that really begs the question, if so many of these benefits can be delivered through collaboration and good design upfront, then why isn't every infrastructure project doing it? And the research suggests that there's 3 themes that are acting as blockers for effective delivery of that value. The first one is process and information. The second is attitudes and governance. And the third is procurement and collaboration. And I'd like to speak about each of those in turn. The first theme is process and information. And the research that I've done suggests that the process whereby design is developed in infrastructure and the information available and used at each stage is really critical in creating a high value outcome for a project. When we think about a traditional understanding of the design process, it's linear. It's like the one that's illustrated on the screen here, which is the RIBA plan of work. In this linear process, a brief is prepared at stage 1, a concept is developed at stage 2, and the design is progressively developed through to delivery at stage 5 and handover at stage 6. And with this approach, you often find that contractors aren't generally appointed until stage 3 or beyond, and maintainers are often not appointed until stage 7. And the research indicates that with infrastructure, this approach is particularly inappropriate, and it can result in 2 critical areas where it fails to produce good value outcomes. And the first of those is a lack of sufficient problem solving and time spent at the very first stages of the project to identify the problem and inform the brief. And the second is valuable intelligence and value available within the maintenance and operational supply chain, which isn't incorporated until too late in the program and isn't used to inform the brief. But there's other ways to think about the design process. And I'd like to talk about this process on the screen now, which is called the double diamond. And this is something that's been developed by the UK Design Council. And it's becoming a framework for thinking about how design can add value in infrastructure projects. And it thinks about design as two phases or diamonds. On the left-hand side is the discover and define stage, and that ensures adequate time is spent up front, engaging with suppliers, maintainers, operators, and stakeholders to fully understand the problem that needs to be solved. And this time is also used to invest, to liaise with wider stakeholders, to recognize that wider value that can be delivered by the project. The second phase, second diamond on the right, is called the develop and deliver stage. And in this stage, iterative design solutions are developed and tested to ensure right first time delivery, and prototyping is used to encourage supply chain innovation and achieve economies of scale. So thinking about design in this way, with the brief in the middle of the process, allows more time for creative and collaborative problem solving early on in the project to maximize and identify value. And it also allows operational maintenance expertise upfront to help define and discover the problem and inform the brief. And I'd like to use this diagram and this process to talk about the next two themes. The next theme is attitudes and governance. So in 2019, the National Infrastructure Commission carried out a lot of research into attitudes and governance around design in infrastructure. And their findings really indicated that owners and stakeholders have very different attitudes to value of design and have different methods of governing its delivery. And this can often result in poor value outcomes. So if we start with the problem on the left, infrastructure owners often lack the expertise in the wider value created by their assets. And they use procurement processes to engage design based on lowest cost. And that's illustrated in the green arrows on the top of the diagram. Stakeholders, wider stakeholders, however, lack expertise in the technical and the engineering constraints of the infrastructure. And they often use statutory processes such as planning consents to influence the design. And that's illustrated in the red arrows on the bottom of the diagram. At the delivery stage, contractors and those delivering the project are often procured on a lowest cost basis to deliver the functional requirements, but they're also tied into engaging with local consents, planning authorities, and design panels who've got different priorities and objectives which aren't necessarily captured in the employer's requirements. And that ultimately is often priced as risk, which delivers poor value for the project. The last theme is procurement and collaboration. What the research has indicated is that infrastructure projects are often developed by re-tendering design services on a lowest cost basis at each design stage, ironically, to demonstrate value. But what this does, it results in several different designers quite often being involved from concept through to ITT and delivery. And this leads to inefficient redesign, lack of continuity, and loss of project knowledge as the project progresses. In addition, the practice of retaining design guardians and engaging contractors with their own design teams too late in the process often creates adversarial positions and doesn't incentivize designers and contractors to work together to maximize value. So many of the benefits that the contractor could bring through innovation is limited by being too late in the program. And at that point, those benefits are often outweighed by the risk of redesign or program extension. And ultimately, the team delivering the project in the bottom right-hand corner of the diagram is kept too separated out from the early design stage where collaborative problem solving is used to maximize and identify value. And this results in poor value creation for the project. So following on from the literature review, I carried out semi-structured interviews with 3 themes that we just discussed forming the basis of those interviews. I interviewed 3 leading infrastructure construction professionals who are directors at Tier 1 contractors, and their experience spanned everything from utilities to rail, aviation, and highways. And in addition, following on from that, I carried out research of 5 follow-up case studies to which I was referred to by the interviewees. And the findings from those interviews are outlined here. Interviewees repeatedly brought up the fact that knowledge and expertise used to inform the brief is really fundamental in delivering the final desired best value outcomes. And this applies in 2 ways. And the first way is the one I touched on earlier, which is maintainer and operational value. And they felt that the long design life of infrastructure, which is often 120 years plus, means maintenance and replacement value is significant, but that briefs focused all too often on product rather than life cycle value, which meant this value was poorly recognized in the briefs. What interviewees also brought up was the lack of contractor expertise early in the process. And they felt that the scale of infrastructure also meant that the value to be derived from innovative forms of construction, such as design for manufacture and prototyping, etc., was often lost. And these construction techniques should really form part of the key requirements of the brief to maximize value. I should mention that one sector that was held up as an exception to this was actually the aviation sector. And those interviewed felt that their briefs were often informed by contractors and life cycle costs with a focus on value outcomes rather than just producing products. Now, there's further findings. Those interviewed often talked about the conflict between owners and stakeholders as being very common. And this was particularly problematic when it arises mid-contract. And they felt it would be ultimately much better to resolve these issues upfront through collaboration before procurement. An interviewee stated that the most successful projects they were involved in were the ones where clients were an integrated part of the delivery team, because this allows change to be made quickly with appropriate buy-in, but also allows questioning from first principles of the design to ensure best value. In addition, those interviewed felt that early involvement of small and medium-sized enterprises and tier 2 contractors was seen to be of greater value to infrastructure clients because it allows innovation to occur early in the design process and reduces project risk on very specialist areas in infrastructure, such as tunneling, etc. And lastly, Project 13, which is an initiative from the Infrastructure Client Group, was often referenced by those interviewed as being a very good exemplar of how early SME and Tier 2 involvement could be enabled. Now, I'd just like to finish by talking about one of the case studies, which I think is a very good illustration of the points that have been made. And this is the Nostrop footbridge, which is part of the Leeds flood alleviation scheme. And the core brief of this piece of infrastructure is a weir. But in order to enhance the wider value of this scheme, the project incorporated a broad range of requirements from stakeholders to go beyond that core function. It incorporated a crossing on the weir for walkers and cyclists. It used a high quality design that thought about how to use the structure of the weir to support the bridge, which ultimately reduced capital cost. It used prefabricated bridge elements that were lifted into place in just 2 days. So it used contractor supply chain innovation to reduce capital risk and program risk. But it also ultimately invested in good design upfront that helped to create a sense of place. And that ultimately served as a catalyst for development of the previously low value adjacent brownfield site, which you see in the top right-hand corner of the image. So this is a very good example in miniature of how joined up thinking and time spent on high quality design upfront allows the infrastructure to harness the wider possible value available. And I'd just like to finish with 4 recommendations which arise from the research. And the first one is a plan of work bespoke for infrastructure. And I believe that the development of a multidisciplinary plan of work specifically designed for infrastructure would offer many benefits. It would provide a standardized roadmap which identifies the opportunities and the benefits that infrastructure can create and when in the project lifecycle these should be locked in. But if it was developed by multiple parties, such as stakeholders and professional institutions and clients and contractors, it would allow for a broad holistic understanding of the infrastructure specific risks and opportunities at each phase of the design. The second recommendation relates to client leadership teams. And I think it's very clear that project leadership teams for nationally significant infrastructure projects should really be drawn from both the infrastructure owner and wider stakeholders, because this would allow for a shared understanding of the project benefits, would also allow for a knowledge of local stakeholder ambitions, even within the context of wider national infrastructure projects. Lastly, briefs. Getting the project brief right is critical. And it's felt the project brief should allow sufficient flexibility for the supply chain to identify how value can best be provided. And lastly, government policy. Collaborative procurement models such as Project 13, which seems to have a lot of support within the industry, should really be supported by government policy and legislation. And if this was done for nationally significant projects, this would help collaborative practices and joined up client teams to become a norm and hopefully create a trickle-down impact on smaller projects. And equally, government support for procurement models that promote early SME and Tier 2 involvement would further serve to promote innovation within the construction industry. That brings me to my last slide. So thank you very much for your time. We're back to you, Martin.
Excellent, Eugene. And once again, I can see the hands clapping there. Thanks very much. Brilliant presentation. Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I guess Project 13 was lucky for us, was our lucky number tonight, Eugene. We went off without a hitch. I know when we did that in rehearsal, we had some technical gremlins. So well done for that. Now we have a few minutes remaining on the agenda. Thanks for everyone sticking to schedule. Do we have any questions? Can anyone would anyone like to offer a question? I can't actually see on my screen if anyone has their hand up. I have a question for Eugene if I can't get one from the floor. Anybody want to offer a question? Okay, Eugene, again, thank you. One thing that struck me about the process that you were thinking about there, is there any way that that you can envision that we could utilize technology to help this process? You know, some kind of digital collaboration tool. Is there anything like that that you unearthed when you were doing your research?
Well, I think there is, and I think we often think of digital collaboration tools such as BIM is a kind of a hot topic at the moment, as being key in delivering these projects. But I think what the research really shows is that the delivery phase of these infrastructure projects is really only a temporary condition. It may be 5 years, but ultimately the project extends to 120 years and beyond. And going beyond the things like BIM being used for delivery, I think things like digital twins, building digital three-dimensional replicas of assets as you build them, and then keeping them as part of your operational and maintenance regime for the project can really offer you long-term value. So within the industry at the moment, digital twins is kind of the new hot topic, I guess. Having a virtual model of your infrastructure that automatically tells you when fixtures and fittings are reaching the end of their life cycle, etc., is I think a fundamental way of how infrastructure needs to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And what I particularly appreciated, Eugene, was your sort of vision at the start of that presentation, where you put two things together that don't normally go together. Infrastructure is often seen as quite essential, but necessary, but not not enriching the public realm. But your idea of seeing infrastructure in a different way, I think, is very helpful. Okay, so we are now bang on schedule. We've got 5 minutes now to have a break, but on the bit of paper that I've got written down in front of me, I can see that it's break stroke networking. So if you want to stay on screen and chat with your friends, you're very welcome to do that as well. Otherwise, we're going to start back at 7 o'clock prompt, where Anna is going to kick off the round table. So please feel free to chat, network, say hello, and we'll be back in a few minutes. Thank you.
Hello, John Sayers. I was thinking about welfare in a basement reconstruction in Chelsea.
Oh yes, our Polish friends. Yes, I saw that. Yes.
I guess this is a real issue, isn't it? Trying to provide the requirements of the law, but also morally. And then you've got people who
not supportive of that, don't actually have any space, and indeed your local authorities are not willing to let you have space. So you get to a point where you could almost argue, I'm sorry, madam, we can't do this project.
Yes, it makes you wonder about the CDM regulations and the client's responsibility for producing all these things.
Well, they don't, do they?
Exactly. They couldn't care less. It's the lowest price.
And the other thing that's struck me listening, we see so many individuals still living in hotbeds and, sharing accommodation, that they use the site welfare as an extension of their living facilities. And so it's not just tables and chairs. These folk need places to lie down and sleep.
Yeah, quite.
Are you seeing any improvement now on the Considerate Constructor scheme?
Well, it's very small. Mackenzie and I did speak about Battersea in the first place because having made so many visits there, it was a good opportunity to look at it from her perspective as well. But yes, I suppose it is getting better. The old door has now been replaced with a laminated table, but the difference is still, well, almost, yes. There's still people eating off bits of mould oil stained formwork and things, and even cutting loaves of bread on it, which is pretty horrendous. But there we are.
Yeah.
Takes all sorts, doesn't it?
Yes, indeed.
I think, just pick up on the point there. One of the real, I thought, movers for improvement was in fact the facilities on the Olympic site in 2012. And I was really impressed by all the contractors' welfare facilities there. But I have to say, in the main, I won't say totally, but it was really pushed and supported by the client. The client, the ODA, Olympic Delivery Authority, made a very specific requirement for welfare facilities. It had to be to a certain standard. And I'm not so sure it was a carrot and stick, but certainly all the contractors really stepped up to the plate. And I think it really did create a better working environment. And I think a lot of the contractors carried on using the standards that they saw that had to provide at the Olympics onto many of the other sites. And it certainly, I did see a step change. But I have to say, it was the larger contractors that were able to take it on and run with it. The SMEs will struggle because they just don't, in many respects, don't have the room on their site. So it doesn't mean so they can't do it. It means to say they've got to do it in a slightly more innovative way. And I think that's the thing that should come out of it. They've got to find ways of providing those facilities, but maybe not in the same much larger ways that the bigger contractors would be able to do it.
Well, having monitored half of the Olympic Park, of course, the extra issue there was that the ODA gave press passes to the world's press for while it was being constructed.
Yeah.
And you could ask any project director and he would say, look, you just can't have a guy walking out of a canteen without his hard hat on, because sure enough, there'd be a Russian or a Chinese camera stuck at him, and you'd be tomorrow's 6 o'clock news around the world as to what the silly English are doing.
Yeah.
And they would love to rubbish it. So there was an extra factor there, and sheer competition. If Taylor Woodrow had a path 2 meters wide, somebody else had to have one 3 meters wide, and so it went on. But it was exciting times.
It was indeed.
Brilliant conversations there, and I'm sure we could maybe get some of that into this next session. So welcome back, everybody. I'm Anna. I'm Head of Social Value for Wilmot Dixon Interiors, but also a former SID scholar myself, a year on, and also yeoman with the WCC. And it's been a real pleasure this year to join the scholarship committee to support the scholars over the last year. So, I mean, we've started to have a bit of a chat. What's really come out loud and strong for me today through these presentations is the value of considerate design and how that can really add greater value to humanity. And I think this is quite a topical conversation right now, especially with the construction playbook, for instance, and the government's review of the Green Book, and how we're starting to look at commercial behaviours and the real meaning of value when we are developing buildings and infrastructure. So we've heard from Mackenzie on how designing welfare facilities to add value not only supports mental health, but also, interestingly, attracting younger generations and diversity and inclusion in construction. And Eugene has looked at how designing in a more efficient, effective way through early collaboration can really add value through infrastructure. And I thought it was so inspiring to see that first slide on the civic value that this can offer. So over the next 20 minutes, I'd like to invite our scholars to join us again, Mackenzie, Eugene, and also their mentors, Ben, Jason, and Martin, to take a deeper discussion on some of the fantastic topics we've heard. And this is really an opportunity to open the debate a little bit wider and offer the audience here this evening to ask more questions. So what I would ask is, if you do have a question for either of our scholars, feel free to raise your hand or drop a question into the text box, and we'll pick that up as we go along. So before I go into a few questions of my own, does anyone have any questions that they might like to kick off with? Nope. Let me just scroll through my two. Tim. Hello, Tim. I've scrolled through the video, so I found you. So please, yes.
Hi. So it's not quite a raised hand on Zoom, is there? You sort of have to wait. Actually,
no, you have to wait.
Just really congratulate both of you for some great presentations. I've also sat where you were, not virtually, some years ago. So I know it's a great achievement. Well done. I've got a question for Mackenzie. I thought your presentation was great, and I sort of would echo some of the bits that Bob was talking about the challenges for SMEs. I think having moved from a tier 1 to an SME, appreciate quite firsthand the differences in welfare. But I was really interested in a bit about how it could encourage diversity and inclusion. I thought that I've never thought about that before, and I wondered if you could maybe expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, so something that I couldn't kind of go into in this talk because it was so short was a project called the McAppy Project. And this was conducted by Cedric Price, who was an architect with Sir McAlpine in the 70s on improving welfare. And what really stood out to me in that research was Cedric Price was looking at like PPE and how that could be developed at the time. And of course, like in the 70s, this was really forward thinking. And yeah, it was a really good sort of project to like dive into and do a case study on. But one of the things he looked at was actually how could Sikhs wear hard hats? And that just stood out to me so clearly. It was just something that I hadn't considered, like what is restricting people in the industry? And actually, when I was designing welfare facilities at Battersea, somebody in our team was Muslim, and she would go off and pray in prayer rooms. And it really brought to me this topic of actually, we need to be providing spaces that are suitable for people and so that they feel welcomed. In one of the interviews I had, I was talking with a lady and she was saying that actually the female WCs are often just a cupboard with the mop and bucket in because there's nobody to use them. But actually her going on site, it didn't make her feel very welcome. So I do think there is a real place for actually using the welfare to bring more people in.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a really great question, Tim. Thanks so much for that question. I think that's really interesting point. And Mackenzie, I just wondered, just picking up on that, you mentioned in your presentation that the welfare facility has often been forgotten or undervalued, and clearly there is a lot of great value. So why do you think that is the case?
So what was clear was that actually welfare has improved massively. So I think that is something to remember. But I think when we think about welfare facilities and their purpose being for well-being, I think that's where we fall short. I think it's quite easy to ensure that actually our welfare facilities provide healthy environments. We're very clear on actually, we need PPE, we need seats with backs or whatever it is to support physical health. But I think that aspect of mental health and happiness are harder to measure. And because of that, not necessarily maliciously, we just haven't included them as much. So I think that's why, I think that's an area we can improve on. We can start looking at actually what makes a happy space, what makes a space that fosters good mental health. And because of that, I think welfare will continue to improve.
And so go on, Martin, you're going to add in there, I think.
Yeah, it was just, I noticed on the chat, it was something that that Paul had raised, that the fact that you know, the public really struggle to understand us as an industry anyway. And I think maybe the fact that there's a challenge there. Obviously, we have a skills challenge and a skills shortage. And I think what you've presented tonight, Mackenzie, is an insight into a way of smashing the myths that I think the public have. And I'm thinking of coming to you, John, Mr. Sawyers. You know, how can we use this sort of insight along with things like Considerate Constructors Scheme to try and, you know, really overturn these perceptions?
Well, I think we can by recommendation, but at the end of the day, we've got no teeth. So they can take the recommendation, they can lose the silver award, or they can rise to the top like our big contractors and get celebrated for what they're doing. But some don't care. Some are controlled by budget. But at the end of the day, we can't force anything. Whether CCA, I doubt. So we'll leave that one for another 10 years to decide what happens to it. But in practice, it is sharing best practice. That was the aim of the thing in the first place.
Yeah, thanks, John. And also there was another comment, Alison, that you put in, Alison Cox. You know, that currently SRM projects are looking to implement some of Mackenzie's recommendations. So it's really nice to see it, you know, that there being an interest there. But it is a challenge. I think we've got to think about how can we get the wider sector on board, and not just the big projects. Bob, that was a point that you raised. Did you have any further thoughts on that, Mackenzie? Just that wider inclusion.
So I think one of the main things is this further research that I recommend. I think if we have some numbers to actually say, yes, investing in welfare is going to improve your productivity, reduce the waste materials, reduce absenteeism and all of those things, then I think it will encourage smaller contractors. I also think there's a role potentially with this idea of using architecture students on smaller sites. From my personal experience, I know that often the first projects that architecture students design are little sort of like huts or like sketching shelters, really small spaces. But actually, I think there's a place where we could actually be using architecture students to design something that's needed, not a sort of magical, you know, theoretical design, but something that actually is benefiting people. So I think that's one way we could reach more people.
Just on that, Mackenzie, how would you advise anyone on the call today to maybe initiate that within their own businesses? You know, how would they go about tapping into the architectural students?
So I think architecture competitions are one way. I think a lot of architecture students are constantly on the lookout for competitions, things to put on their CV, things to sort of raise their awareness. Also contacting universities themselves. Of course, as architecture students, it takes us 7 years to qualify. So I'm still not qualified as an architect. I've still got a few more years, but we do have some skills that we can offer, and actually contacting universities and working with the university, I think, is one route to go down.
Brilliant. And before we move over to Eugene to ask a few more questions about his research, it'd be lovely to come over to Ben or even some of Mackenzie's mentors from Jeff or Alex. But Ben, just coming to you, what are your thoughts? You know, obviously from your perspective and your business, is there anything that you are taking away from this to integrate into your own business?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I think a couple of things. I think picking up Bob's question from earlier, and I think Mackenzie, you said it, and I totally agree. I think there's some legislation required around this. So the only way we're going to really see a change is when we legislate for that, and then people have no choice but to follow and then come up with the innovative solutions. And unfortunately, I think that's definitely required. I think also, as Mackenzie said, we need to measure some of these benefits. So if we should legislate to make an improvement, and then we should recommend to our employers and sort of contacts. There's definitely, we all know it, and working with Mackenzie over the last period, we know that there's benefits from this. And she's mentioned it. It's productivity, it's absenteeism, it's less churn. If we have a site with 100 people, we probably induct 300 people to deliver those sites. So if we could measure that and come up in a future study and come up with some of the benefits, I think that will sort of encourage big and small organisations to put more effort in on this front. We've got an obligation to look after our people, and clearly with mental health and coronavirus is only going to accelerate the amount of effort we have to put in looking after our people. And just, I guess I'm repeating, Mackenzie, what you said, because I'm a believer, but it is our front of house, and it's definitely something we need to improve to attract a more diverse workforce into our industry.
Brilliant. I'm just scrolling through and I can see Neil's got his hand up.
First of all, can I just I used to be Mackenzie's product design teacher in a secondary school, and first of all, I'm extremely proud. Number one, that she invited me. Number two, that she actually produced an absolutely fantastic sort of presentation. So I'll give her a big clap for that just myself, right? And just use one of the emojis on my side there, as you can see, right? So there's you, Mackenzie. So basically, we're talking about legislation. I think there's things, and I really do believe, and that has to be some sort of a new paradigm shift in the way we look at and the way we interact with our fellow people and our fellow workers. And one of the things is maybe something like this, and also what Eugene presented, could be taken to authorities like the Good Growth by Design, and get them to introduce them into their sort of strategies of when people are applying, or architectural practices, or companies are trying to apply or put out for tender. You can say, right, you've got to have some of these formats in your strategies. If not, we're not going to accept it. We all know that it's going to cost, and there is a cost, because that is why that people don't do it voluntarily. Is because the person who's building it, the person who's involved in it, is thinking cost. But what we have to do is try and get away from the cost and say, like Ben just said, if we create a better working environment, and what Mackenzie just said, and Eugene, if we create a better working environment, the productivity will go up, and they've got to be shown examples of this through good practice, and the good practices have got to be celebrated all the time, and have got to be championed by yourself and by other architectural practices, by the media, etc., etc. They're the ones who have got to be championed. And it's not until we have this sort of lifestyle change will people actually accept recommendations that were of the fantastic presentations that we've been given tonight.
Brilliant. Thanks, Neil, so much. I'm going to come over to Alex, and then I'm going to come across to Eugene and actually drill into that cost question, because I think it's really appropriate for that. So Alex, just over to you before we move to Eugene.
I'd just like to say congratulations to Mackenzie. I think it's an incredible presentation, and a mature presentation beyond your years. And that is something that we've seen throughout the process. And I think you've done a remarkable job. And what I think it shows us in all of this is this idea of education. And I think Neil's conversation at the end was fantastic. For, Neil starts this process and maybe starts Mackenzie off on this journey of using her creativity to challenge the social norms. And I would challenge all of you in the Worshipful Company to think about how Mackenzie's presentation can challenge your own kind of practice and your duty of care, I think, beyond. And yes, Mackenzie has looked at the tier 1 contractors who are doing remarkable things, and in particular, the work as Robert McAlpine, led by Alison Cox, within this work, which is kind of championing this kind of process. There is a trickle down, and it starts at the top. And I do think it's about leadership. And I think this organization is one of those organisations within the City of London that's about how do we lead this industry further forward. And I believe that what Mackenzie has done has been a vital starter in that process. And it is about education, 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 to borrow a very bad old Prime Minister of ours.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks for all the support that you've offered Mackenzie over the last year. Eugene, coming across to you now, and for anyone who might have a question for Eugene, this is your time to ask it. But what are your thoughts on what was mentioned about costs, about commercial behaviours, and how that impacts the design and the adding of value? I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
You're on mute, Eugene.
There you go. I'm still coming to terms with this technology. I mean, I guess my reaction is none of this is new to anybody. The Latham report was published in mid-90s, 94, 25, 27 years ago. And a key recommendation of that to the construction industry was that public sector bodies should procure for lowest cost. And that was the kind of one of the key mantras. And that did have an impact. It led to, the use of things like NEC, more collaborative contracts, widespread use within the construction industry, particularly within infrastructure. But it wasn't really backed up substantially with legislation, coming back to that idea again about things starting from the top. So although we all seem to recognize that big projects should be procured, particularly large, significant public projects should be procured based on value rather than lowest cost, it doesn't seem to still be happening as well as it should have. And I'm not quite sure what the reasons are for that, and maybe other people on the call might have an opinion. But I guess in the absence of that legislation, all that's left is for significant projects, large-scale infrastructure projects in particular, to lead by example, and by promoting kind of collaborative behaviours, promoting procurement for value rather than lowest cost. Someone mentioned a trickle-down effect, and I think that's what you look for with these large-scale projects, is to really have a transformative impact on the industry by leading, for example, by example.
Brilliant, thanks, Eugene. Does anyone have any questions for Eugene at this stage? Just going to scroll, see if anyone has anything, and look through the box.
Roger Adcock, I can see hand up. Roger, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you. Yes, Eugene, congratulations. It's a really fantastic presentation and synopsis of your study. I enjoyed it immensely. It just seems to me that we've listened to you this evening on a particular day inside the Grenfell debacle and tragedy, that it has singularly destroyed the reputation of construction industry in the eyes of Joe Public, in that it has said in court that the construction industry buys the lowest common denominator. And that doesn't matter whether it's a block of flats where it's going to have 300 people living in it, or the embankment extension that you showed us that Bazalgette did all those years ago. It was always price. It's always price. It's always price. All these great and wonderful things that we know from inside the industry are necessary, we just don't seem to be able to get that through to those who, at the end of the day, write a check. I just wondered really how you thought we could really try and get, I suppose it's government really to start with, being our biggest client, to accept that actually it's not cost, it's value.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the fundamental problem. I mean, I do see signs of things changing, but at a very glacial pace. And the National Infrastructure Commission, for example, was set up as an independent body away from government to really look at these kind of issues from first principles. And they produced, as I mentioned, a report looking at the value rather than the lowest cost. And that's formed part of the national infrastructure strategy that's just come out from the government. So although they don't explicitly say that, or set out precise ways that projects should be procured based on value rather than cost, they are beginning to introduce requirements for these large-scale projects to have quality more at the front of their agenda, to have design and quality champions that sit on the board of these projects who take sole responsibility for delivery of the value, not the lowest cost or the program. And also, they've mandated the use of design panels and advisory panels to help provide kind of objective guidance as to what value you should be. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have, I mean, you're completely preaching, singing to the choir, talking to an architect about about quality. But I agree. I think it's about winning hearts and minds. I think you need to convince those responsible in government of the value of this, and it's difficult. It's difficult to do because, particularly with infrastructure projects, because the news and the media is so overwhelmingly negative. When you think about the last time you read a story about Crossrail, was it a positive news story? Was anyone talking about the benefits? Was anyone talking about the value? No, they were talking about the cost overrun and the program overrun. So it's something about maybe it's something, I'm speaking as not a UK native originally here, but maybe it's something about the national psyche, about how we view these things.
About culture.
Yeah, a cultural thing about a fear of failure rather than focusing on on what we could gain from these projects. So it's a difficult one to resolve.
Well, look, thank you. Oh, sorry, Martin.
I must jump in with this analogy. Eugene, you started off by talking there about the glacial pace that things go at. Well, as an environmentalist, I've got to say the glaciers are melting, and I think that's gonna get us to to address your point, Roger. That's making the whole population really see the difference between cost and value, and I think that now public opinion is starting to change. We are seeing a tide. I mean, even the Daily Express and the Sun newspaper have launched their green campaigns. Who would have thought that would ever happen? But I think the time is now, and I think the points that you guys have raised tonight, this is the moment to seize on this. And I think, looking at some of the comments in the chat, we're going to capture that, and we're going to actually try and see what we can do to move this forward.